Let's discuss the origins of American slavery. First, let's go back and look at slavery in history. And what we're going to be talking about is what's called chattel slavery. And this is the type of slavery where a person is a possession. A person is something that can be bought or sold. And this type of slavery has existed since ancient times. The Greeks and Romans had slaves. However, in Greek and Roman times, slavery was not based on race. Race based slavery began when Arab traders began taking black African slaves as property um, no later than the 1300s. Europeans get involved with Africa and African slavery with two major innovations in sailing. The first is the caravel, which we've already talked about. That's that ship with square sails, and what it could do was sail into the wind much better than previous ships. And the discovery of what are called prevailing winds or trade winds. What Europeans would do is actually, and it looks counterintuitive, is they would sail out there to the Azores west of Portugal, and then they could easily sail back towards Africa. It also made the trip home a lot easier. So the Portuguese and then the Spanish are going to set up trading posts on the African shore where they're going to purchase slaves from slave traders, and they're going to use these slaves to work on sugar plantations on Madeira, on the Canary Islands, and on the Azores. And some of this sugar is used as sugar, and some of this sugar, as you read about over the summer, is used to make alcohol. But what this does, the sugar trade on these Atlantic islands and the Portuguese and the Spanish purchasing these slaves, it takes the slave trade, which used to be a small operation, and really turns it into big business. And on the islands where they're producing sugar, we have what will be used as the model of the plantation system, copied in the Caribbean and eventually in the American South. After slaves were captured, when they were taken, they would be mixed with people of different tribes and with people from different regions. And the purpose for this was to prevent resistance. By mixing people, it destroys any remaining identity they might have with their previous region, their previous village, their previous people. And they become part of this slave culture, which is kind of a collection of African cultures. Now, before using African slaves in the New World, there are major attempts, especially by the Spanish, to use Indians as slaves. And we see most of that in that encomienda system, which we've read about. This is where Spanish officers or conquistadors were given land by the crown. And in return, they were supposed to protect those Indian villages within their land. And they were supposed to support the missionary priests in their conversion of the natives. And as a result of doing these things, the Spanish officers would receive labor and goods from the Indians. What this ended up with was that you had extremely wealthy landowners and very, very poor Indians. As you can probably guess, like on Madeira and the Canaries and the Azores, one of the major industries in the New World using Indian slavery and later African slaves is sugar, especially in the Caribbean. And like before, some of that sugar is used for, or some of that is used for molasses and sugar, and some of that is converted into rum. Another industry that is popular for Indian slave labor or using Indian slave labor is the very dangerous mining of silver. Using Native Americans proved unsuccessful for the Spanish. For one reason is the big one we've already talked about a lot, and that's smallpox, as well as other diseases. Another problem is that Native Americans had a very strong and even better understanding than Europeans of the surrounding land, which meant many of them would run away and could get away and could escape. They also have relatives and friends in the nearby area, possibly, who might help free them and fight for their freedom. And there are numerous instances of Native Americans taking their own life, committing suicide, even committing mass suicide, rather than to continue to work for the Spanish or other Europeans. By 1500, the Indian population has been drastically reduced. Remember, Columbus set sail in 1492, okay? So just 8 years later, there's been a dramatic drop off in the number of Caribbean Native Americans. So much so that by 1550, these people are almost extinct. They're almost completely gone from the region. So, how do Europeans start using African slaves in the New World? Well, that sugar production that was taking place in the Caribbean, even using Indian labor, only served to increase the demand for sugar and liquor back in Europe. So by 1503, Europeans began transporting African slaves, not just from Africa to the Azores, but from Africa all the way across the ocean to the Caribbean. Black slaves were used by the Portuguese in Brazil, the Spanish in their Caribbean colonies and in Central America, as well as other powers in other colonies throughout the New World. So what was life like for these early African slaves? How did their culture change and adjust? Well, in summary, in spite of slavery, Africans' culture, including like their language, really adapted in the Western Hemisphere. And as a result, what you have is kind of a varying degree of some culture being preserved and even some slave culture remaining autonomous and having a little bit of its own independence. We can see things like that in the religion of African slaves. We have overall a real mixing of the Christianity that Europeans were forcing on them and traditional African religions. Slaves were often forced to convert, but they often continued to hold on to some of their traditional beliefs. One example of this is Haitian voodoo. This combines West African Vodun, which is a religion where, for example, spirits control different aspects of life. It combines that idea from West Africa with the idea of a creator god, but the creator god does not really interfere with people's lives on a regular basis. And in Haitian voodoo, the name for that creator god is very similar to the French word for good lord. So if we look at the language that's used and the beliefs, it really looks like a blending of Christianity and West African religions. In terms of autonomy and maintaining some independence, runaway slaves throughout the New World created a few maroon communities. There are a lot of these in Brazil. There are some on Caribbean islands. And there was even maroon communities in the Everglades in Florida. This is where runaway slaves could live together in isolation, but also live as they want and hold on to their culture. They were separated from white society.